you're intrigued. Well, let me pray for us, and then we're going to go ahead and start. God, we're so grateful for this opportunity. We thank you for the food tonight. It was so good. And thank you for the hands that prepared it. We just pray, God, that you would bless us now as we study your word and get to learn more about the world of Jesus. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Well, tonight we're going to be looking at life in Judea, Jewish culture in the time of Jesus. But one of the things we want to do first is do a little bit of geography, because that also plays into our understanding of this culture. So you see here a red map of the Roman Empire. You've got from Italy, Rome, all the way to the east. So some scholars refer to the Roman Empire or the Mediterranean as a Roman lake, because the Roman Empire by the first century had expanded to its easternmost point. Of course, the Parthian Empire is over here. Most people think that's where the Magi came from. That's the remnants of the old Persian Empire. There's a natural barrier between Israel on the coast and the Parthian Empire, and that's the Arabian Desert, which is very stark. And when you think of a desert with big sand dunes, that's what the Arabian Desert looks like. One of the things I like to point out, though, is that if we go back to the Old Testament, we remember that God, the people are slaves in Egypt, and they go through the Red Sea and then onto the Sinai Peninsula. They're there for 40 years before they enter into the Promised Land. And one of the interesting things about this particular strip of land, and this is a Bob Kaylor theory, you can play with this however you want. If you think of all these ancient empires that were around in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament period. So you have the Empire of Egypt, you had the Hittite Empire, you have the Parthian Empire, you had the Assyrian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire over here in the area of modern-day Iraq and Iran. You have the Roman Empire. You have all these empires. But if they're going to interact with one another, and particularly if they're going to go to war with one another, where do they have to go to get at one another if they're not going to use the sea? They have to go through this strip of land, which is about the size of New Jersey. And as I often say, if you think of all these ancient empires, and they come and go, as rooms in a house, when God gives Israel their promised land, it's in the hallway. People are always having to go through and out, and that's why that diaspora becomes so important, because what's happening? This is a place where it's always going to be subject to invasion. People are always going to be scattered and then come back and scatter and come back. So it's kind of an interesting place. Plus, it's the one Middle Eastern country that has no oil. No natural resource like that. It's a very interesting place when God says, I'm going to give you this land flowing with milk and honey, but not Texas tea, black gold, things like that. This is your promised land. But we'll see, from a geographic standpoint, certainly it looks better than the Sinai Peninsula, but is it really that fantastic? So if we look at, I got a couple different maps here just to kind of give you an idea of the geography. You see here a list of cities, so just to kind of orient you, Jerusalem is in the south. Jericho is here along the Jordan River. Most of Jesus' ministry takes place around the Sea of Galilee, particularly on the northern parts of the Sea of Galilee. When we talk about the area of the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes, the demoniac, that Jesus heals, that's on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, which would be a Gentile area. So if you sort of take the Jordan River and cut it, that would cut in between sort of the Jewish areas and the Gentile areas over here. There are 10 cities, one of them, there are several around here, that are called cities of the Decapolis. And Romans settled those cities. They're very Roman cities, so people would come there to settle. And if you come with us to Israel, we go visit one of those, Beit Shan. And so, again, when anywhere, do as the Romans do. You show up in Beit Shan, you might as well be in Rome. It's the same kind of thing. But you have Jesus operating primarily in this area and then occasionally going to Jerusalem, and of course makes the great trek there. In Luke chapter 2, when Jesus and his family go to Jerusalem for the festival, the way that they're going to go is from Jerusalem to Jericho and back home to Nazareth, which is right here. But if you're going to go that way, you're going to follow the Jordan River Valley instead of taking the direct route. Why? Well, two reasons. One, this is a very mountainous area right here. And two, you have to go through Samaria. And we'll talk more about the Samaritans here in a minute. But one of the major features here that's unique to this area is what we call the Great Rift Valley. So you notice from this relief map, the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake, is fed by these mountains to the north, but that flows down through a major fault line that runs from this area all the way down to almost the Horn of Africa, down toward Lake Victoria. It's called the Great Rift Valley. So it's a major tectonic fault line. So when you go down to Jericho or you're down at the Dead Sea, you are 1,300 feet below sea level. In fact, when you take a bus down from Jerusalem, you pass a sign halfway down that says sea level. And you go all the way down. Now, Jerusalem sits at 2,700 feet above sea level. So when you think about Jesus telling the story of the Good Samaritan, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Oh, did he go down? 4,000 feet of elevation in 13 miles. It's a very steep drop down there. But that valley is important because it kind of separates the country. It's the primary fresh water source for this area, as you can see. But the settlement up here in Jerusalem is because of defense. You find a natural spring, you build on that natural spring. There's a Gihon spring that feeds Jerusalem, and in ancient warfare, if you want to capture a city, you want to capture the water source. Once you capture the water source, it's game over. So a lot of these places are trying to defend. When David, in fact, invades Jerusalem back in the Old Testament, one of the ways that he does so is by having his men shinny up the water shaft from the Gihon spring into the city. We know that as Hezekiah's tunnel today. And you can go visit that. It's a dank, dark place, but you can literally go up into the city from the spring. So water is very important, but again, this is a very, very small area. This whole area is about the size of New Jersey. So you've got some very diverse ecosystems in this region. For example, everything down here in this valley and down to the south is all desert. And I'm talking like surface of the moon kind of desert. It's rocky. There's not much that grows there. There are Bedouins who still inhabit out there. They herd animals. You'll see, we drive down to Jericho, you often see herds of wild camels running around down there. It's a very remote, very desert-like place. But when you go to the coast, you see massive farming. It's beautiful, fertile, picking up the rain off the Mediterranean. And then around the Sea of Galilee is also a heavy farming area. So when Jesus is telling parables, where are most of his parables set? On the farm. Why? Because people around that region would know they're living that lifestyle. Down here in the desert, not so much. This is a different view of it, and you could sort of see. So here's Nazareth, here's Jerusalem. Samaria is in the middle, and that's a problem because the Samaritans and Jews don't get along. We'll talk about why here in a minute. But it does give you a sense of that geography. So people are living in different regions, even in this small area, because how are you going to get from place to place? your primary mode of transportation is walking. You might have a pack animal of some nature, but usually don't ride them for a long period of time. If you have a horse, that means you're probably military or very, very wealthy. As one ancient scholar says, when you see someone riding a horse, that's the modern equivalent of having an F-16, a fighter plane. If your army has horses and chariots, you now have an air force. That's what it looks like. But this is also, because of this region and because we saw, all of these different cultures needed to transverse through Israel to go from place to place, it's a mixed bag of things that are happening. Now, the Jews obviously inhabit this area, but there are lots of different people coming through it at any given time. So if you were, say, Peter, James, and John on the Sea of Galilee, and their particular place of operation was here in Capernaum, north of the Sea of Galilee. You can still visit the ruins of Capernaum today. It's a really cool place to visit, and even see what they've identified as Peter's house there in Capernaum. It actually, in Hebrew, it's pronounced Kafar Nahum, house of Nahum. We don't know if it's a biblical prophet, Nahum, but it's that. But the main trade route coming through goes right over the north part of the Sea of Galilee. So they're selling their fish to all kinds of different people who are coming through, dried fish, fresh fish, what have you. But they would need to know several different languages. The common language that everybody spoke was Aramaic. So Aramaic, if you look at Aramaic written out, it looks more like Arabic. And it sounds like Arabic. If you want to get an example, it's a dead language, but if you want to get an example of Aramaic, if you've seen Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, the disciples, Jesus, they're all speaking Aramaic. The religious language, though, the language that the scrolls and texts that were read in the synagogue was Hebrew or Greek, but a lot of times Hebrew. Commerce, however, as we said last week, was Greek. Why? Because of Hellenization, because of Alexander the Great. And then you have the civil language of the Roman Empire, which is Latin. So notice when Jesus is crucified, Pilate is going to put the charge above his head that he's the king of the Jews. And it's written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Why? So everybody can read it. Literacy levels in the ancient world, it's hard to estimate, but probably about 10 to 15%, but higher among the Jews. Why? Because they're people of the book. They're learning to read those scrolls from the time they're young. Jews and Christians, probably some of the more literate people in the ancient world. The economy, of course, being where it is and being in a very rural area. The cities are not big. Most would estimate that the size of Jerusalem was, somewhere at the most around 40,000. So not a massive, probably about the size of York, actually. Not a huge city. But at different times, it would swell to over, maybe 200,000 because of people coming in for various festivals like Passover and things like that. But most people lived out in the country, small towns and villages, and they would grow crops, wheat, barley, olives, vineyards. Barley primarily for animal feed, but the poor often ate barley. Remember the story of Ruth. Ruth is out there gleaning barley. Why? Because that's the grain for poor people. She's eating what the animals eat. Sort of like if we ate seed corn, or field corn that's left out there till November. It doesn't taste the same as Pennsylvania sweet corn. Nothing tastes like Pennsylvania sweet corn, by the way. Herding is another thing. And in fact, today, even as you travel around this area, you will see herdsmen herding sheep and goats from place to place. That has not changed very much. Fishing on the Sea of Galilee. If you come with us to Israel, we are still going. They're restarting tours in May, so there's still some space. Commercial break here. If you want to come with us, September 1st to 11th, there's still space. But we go to a restaurant on the Sea of Galilee. They take fresh caught fish from the Sea of Galilee and they fry it for you. It's staring at you, but they fry it for you. And it's tilapia, basically tilapia. That's the main fish that grows there in the freshwater Sea of Galilee. And then subsistence farming, people farming, their little plot of land. And if you remember the Old Testament, one of the things that is very important is the Israelite land laws, that things get passed down from place to place because the land is your primary subsistence. It's not just I buy a property, then I go work somewhere else. The land is generally part of your whole economy. But it's also a very stratified society in terms of social hierarchy. So you have the ruling elites, which is a very small number. That would be the families of, by the time Jesus is an adult, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, their dependents, those who are part of the royal family, the royal house. And then you have regional elites like landowners, wealthy merchants, these military leaders like Cornelius, or royal officials. Notice how many times Jesus is telling a parable about a landowner, and the landowner has a vineyard, but there are tenants in the vineyard, so there's a social hierarchy that goes with that. You have municipal elites, smaller landowners, merchants, veterans of the Roman army, maybe, or some other veterans, lower level officials like scribes and priests, and then the professional class, small merchants, shopkeepers, artisans, skilled laborers, and even fishermen. We often think of Jesus' disciples as being on the very bottom end of the social scale. They're probably more towards the middle because they're not dirt poor. I mean, they're actually making money. So when they leave behind something, it's not like I'm leaving my fishing nets behind. They weren't doing any good for me anyway. They're actually leaving behind fairly lucrative careers and a way of life. Matthew, the tax collector, leaves behind his connection to the Romans. That was the source of his wealth. You've got these people who are leaving behind some significant things, and it's why, Peter at one point says, "Hey, look, Jesus, we've left everything to follow you. What do we get? What's our take for this? What's in it for me?" And of course, Jesus says, "Whoever's left father, mother, lands, jobs, you'll receive even more in the kingdom." And they're like, "Okay, well, when's that coming? That'd be nice if that was coming soon." So it's a very stratified society. Then you get down to the peasant class, to unskilled laborers, and then you have the lower end of the social scale where you get to beggars, prostitutes. Now, prostitution in the ancient world was often the only recourse for a woman who was not connected to a household or a male patriarch. So when we look at people, we make judgment, they decided to go into the sex trade. Oftentimes it was their only option. Widows, disabled people, the orphan, the lepers. Who is God most concerned about? Read through the Old Testament. Read who Jesus spends most of his time with. He spends most of his time with these folks. They're at the very bottom end of the scale. And then there are slaves. Now, when we think about slavery, we always think about the chattel slavery that was here in our country for the first couple hundred years of our existence. Slavery in the ancient world is a little different. It's not based on race. It's not based so much on those stratifications in society. It's based on either you were conquered, or you're destitute, or you have been born into slavery. So anybody could become a slave. That was true up until very late in the Middle Ages. I mean, anybody could become a slave because if you were economically disadvantaged, let's say the story of Saint Nicholas, that comes out of the 6th century. Saint Nicholas, for example, there's a man who has 2 daughters. they don't have enough for a dowry. No one's going to marry them. So the father's about to sell his daughters into slavery in order to be able to pay his debts. Well, Nicholas comes in with a bag of gold, throws it through the window, it lands in their stockings, and Merry Christmas. That's how that works. But that's the way it was in the ancient world. If you were conquered, if you're captured territory, you could become a slave. How many of you have seen the movie Ben-Hur? So you've seen Ben-Hur. Judah Ben-Hur comes from a wealthy family, wealthy Jewish family, but when things go bad, what do? He becomes a slave. That could happen to anyone. So we have to that doesn't mean it was a picnic. Being a slave, you obviously had lost a lot of your freedom. But you could buy your way out of slavery. You could earn enough to buy your way out. You could be manumitted by your master. This is one of the interesting things about the New Testament, where if you read the letter to Philemon, for example, what is Paul saying to Philemon? Hey, you've had a slave run away. He's run to me. I'm sending him back to you, but I want you to treat him not as a slave, but as a brother. That's just blowing up that institution. Slavery was the engine that ran things in the Roman world. And it ran things here for a couple hundred years, particularly in the South. So when you think about slavery, you kind of have to think in broader terms in the ancient world. The cultural values, though, things that we look at and say, these are assumptions that people have about the way things work, the way things are. It's just the way that it is. So when you think about American cultural values, what are some things that we just take for granted as the way things are? Individual rights and freedoms, right to free speech. Anything else you can think of? Freedom of religion. We think of anyone can be anything they want to be. That's a cultural value. May not be absolutely true, but it's a cultural value. Think about all these things that we take for granted as assumptions about who we are. Well, in the ancient world of first century Judaism, there are several different kinds of cultural values that are quite different than what we assume when we read the Bible. We kind of read our own values back onto it. We have to understand these through the lens of people who were there in the first century. So 3 main ones are family and kinship, honor and shame, and purity and pollution. So family and kinship. Everything is based on the father's house. Extended family lived together in a single household, along with dependents, servants, and slaves. So the patriarch in the ancient world is the source of power and identity and economic security. When we talk today about the patriarchy, that was the thing in the ancient world. Family was the means of distributing wealth and property, honor, your name, your future, all tied to this particular household and this particular patriarch. People are named after their father, son of. Remember we talked about last week, what are the 3 G's? Gender, genealogy, geography. Very important. This is a cutaway of a typical first century Israelite house. Now there's some things you're going to notice here. First of all, where does the main living space? Upstairs, an upper room. A couple other things you notice. Kitchen space is down here, storage space down here. What's going on here? You keep some of your most expensive or most prized animals inside the house. The roof is usually made of mud, but usually reinforced so that you can walk on it. A lot of times what happens in the story of David and Bathsheba, where is she taking a bath? On the roof. Where is Peter praying when he gets the vision about Cornelius? He's up on the roof. So that's living space too. If you go to Israel today, the roofs, generally speaking, if they're Jewish homes, are not pitched roofs, they're flat roofs. which you can get away with in a place where it doesn't rain that much. But I want to go here for a second, because when we think about the Christmas story, for example, and we think about Mary and Joseph showing up in Bethlehem, and the Motel 6 is full, the Holiday Inn has no vacancy, and now they're going to have to go find some random stable and give birth. No. The word in Greek that we translate as the inn is not the same word that's used in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where on the way down, the man gets beaten up. The Samaritan takes the man to an inn and has his wounds dressed and things like that. Well, of course, you're going to find an inn on the road to Jericho because it's 13 miles and you're going 4,000 feet of elevation. But most likely, when Mary and Joseph show up in Bethlehem, because it's Joseph's ancestral home. And one of the things you don't do if you're family is let people sleep on the street. So likely, because the census is taking place, the upper room is filled with people. It's not a great place to have a baby. You need space for that. Where was there space in the house? On the bottom floor. Now, we always have the animals standing around, while the manger's there and things. Well, most likely, the manger was just a convenient place to put the baby inside the house, not necessarily that they were in the stable, because the stable is in the house. And it's down here because, one, for security, also warmth. Now, you might need an air freshener, but it's for warmth. In Bethlehem, for example, if you go to Bethlehem and you visit the Church of the Nativity, the manger, the accepted site, is actually underneath the church in a cave. And what they discovered was that most of these buildings in Bethlehem, these homes, were built up against these series of caves. So if you had a home like this, you might have it built up against a cave, and the cave is where you put the animals, but it's downstairs in the house. So you go down to where the animals are, and that's where there's enough space for her to give birth and privacy and things like that. So this, every Christmas play ever has the innkeeper saying, "No, there's no room in the inn." Well, it may not have been like that. Probably not. But everyone's living in this space. It's not like you have lots of individual rooms and indoor plumbing and all those kinds of niceties. You're living in a space, and it would be like a compound. There's also probably a courtyard where washing and other things can take place, but it's a very confined space. And so when you go to a place like Capernaum and you see the way things are laid out, it's all laid out in these kinds of clusters where these families live together in multiple generations. But Jesus, as we've said, does not follow conventional Jewish identity formation by putting everything in the family. Remember, he's probably about 30 years old, not married, despite what the Da Vinci Code says. So I remind people that's on the fiction shelf for a reason. But he kind of flips over these three G's a little bit. He elevates the status of women in his ministry. He refers to God as his father. Yes, he never talks about Joseph. Now, that may just be an omission by the gospel writers, but he certainly learned his trade from Joseph up until his adulthood. But Joseph is not in the picture when Jesus is as an adult, which leads a lot of people to believe that he died. Remember, the life expectancy is what? Age 35? So it's quite possible Joseph might have died early in Jesus' life, although we do know Jesus has brothers and sisters as well. So there's some period of time, there's a lot of mystery about that. but he refers to God as his Father. And then he doesn't stay in one place. He's traveling around, and he says, my kingdom is not from this world. So he's got a lot of different things going on in terms of blowing up this family. And we call this fictive kinship. He redefines what the family means. Matthew 12:50, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, sister, and mother. Different sort of family. It's a male-dominant culture, attachment to the father's name and family line. Again, we talked about this. This is not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know. How can he say, I've come now from heaven? What are you talking about? It's very weird. Geography. Society was much less mobile. I mean, we move across the country all the time, but imagine having to walk even, 50 miles with all your stuff. People don't move around a lot. And because of that, where you were from says a lot about you. Now, we've talked about Nazareth. Nathanael says to Philip, hey, can anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, that is a blip of a place on the edge of a cliff up in the hills. These are hillbillies. You sure Messiah is a hillbilly, kind of thing? But I love Paul when he writes to Titus. And he says in the letter to Titus, Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons. And there are people in our culture who read that and say, Paul, you should not generalize like that. It's not fair to categorize an entire group of people based on where they live. But you know what? In the ancient world, if you said to a Cretan, hey, we've heard you're liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons, they'd go, yeah, that's us. That's who we are. We take on that identity. Geography marks who you are. One of the reasons why people have a hard time seeing Jesus as Messiah, isn't this guy from Galilee? I mean, he's supposed to come from the line of David, but really? So he's blowing up these things that are so ingrained in people's understanding that they have a hard time figuring out what he's about. Hence, Jesus the stranger. Marriage, this is a fascinating thing because we always read back onto the Bible our image of what marriage and weddings and all those kinds of things look like. Did you know that marriages were not performed in the church until the 16th century? Because primarily they were not religious ceremonies. They were primarily about economic arrangements. So there was no wedding ceremony in the first century world. Girls got married about age 14. Men were usually a little bit older. So think about when the angel comes to Mary, she's probably about 14 years old. Miranda, 14-year-olds, think they're ready? Yeah. 9th graders? Yeah. Ready to go for marriage? Yeah. No. But of course, back then, there was a lot more expected of you at age 14 than there is now. So it was a contract between families. And they literally sign, and in a Jewish wedding, they still do this, they sign the ketubah, which is the marriage agreement. And there's money exchange, there's a betrothal, they negotiate the dowry, and while that's all taking place, the couple lives apart. But when the groom and his family have enough money or the bride price is ready to be paid, that's when the groom, just one day, either it's prearranged or it's spontaneous, comes to the bride's family home with his companions, and the bride awaits with her maidens, and the consummation of the marriage takes place. I read a couple sources on this. One says it takes place in her parents' home, but others say it takes place in the groom's parents' home. Wherever it takes place, everybody's waiting outside while they go inside to consummate the marriage. No pressure, right? In fact, they had to bring out a cloth with menstrual blood on it to demonstrate that the marriage had been consummated. That would really screw up a reception in our world, but but that's the custom. So again, it's sort of this economic arrangement. The wedding party then processes to the groom's house for the feast, the wedding feast. So where do we see this in the New Testament? It's a constant image. John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana. What we're seeing is not the wedding reception, we're seeing the wedding feast, which could go on as long as 7 days. And what happens? They run out of wine. They have no wine. Woman, I love when Jesus says to his mother, woman, what is that to me? My time's not yet. Yeah, but they don't have any wine. Do something. You're supposed to be, and so he does it. But that keeps the wedding feast going longer. The parable of the 10 bridesmaids. 5 of them are ready. Their wicks are trimmed because you never know when the groom's going to show up, and he shows up at night. And the other 5, well, they slept. They didn't trim their wicks. They didn't have enough oil, and so they're left out of the party because they don't have any lamps. And while they're out buying oil, everybody goes to the groom's house. The door is shut, and they're out. Parable of the wedding banquet. Hey, here's this great banquet I'm going to throw, but the other people said, I can't really come to the banquet. So what does the host do? He sends out into the streets and says, y'all come to my banquet. The wedding feast of the Lamb that we see in Revelation is also an image of that. So that marriage metaphor is very important to Jesus, and often it becomes a metaphor for his relationship with the church. The eschatological idea of Jesus returning. He's returning like the bridegroom. Why do your disciples not fast? The Pharisees asked. Should the bridegroom's attendants fast while the bridegroom is with them? We're getting ready for marriage here. The New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. I love that imagery of those things coming together. Our modern wedding ceremony has echoes of this, but it's not quite the same. Now it's kind of the opposite. The groom waits while the bride comes down the aisle. And so we have a lot of medieval customs and 19th century customs and things like that have crept into our wedding, but it's actually very recent. Although I do love that moment. I love the moment in a wedding. I would rather do a funeral than a wedding. I'll tell you why. Because at a funeral, everybody's paying attention. That's going to be me someday. I better listen up because everybody's thinking about, that's what everybody's thinking about. At a wedding, nobody's thinking about what the pastor's saying. Nobody. I'm talking about how love is, agape, you got to give yourselves to one another. Oh, yes, of course. It's flowers and hearts and all that kind of stuff. But I love that moment when the door opens, and if they've done it traditionally and the groom has not seen the bride, there's an audible gasp. Wow. I remember my wedding day. The same thing was like, wow. That's a moment you can't replicate. It's powerful stuff. So imagine this anticipation and waiting for the groom to arrive. That's the idea for us. Jesus says is to be ready for when the groom arrives, because that's when the real party's going to start. There's a fine line between teaching and preaching here. I'm gonna admit right away. Okay, so you might get a little bit of both tonight. Honor and shame. Now, this is a key driver of social capital because it's the foundational understanding for all these ancient societies. It's still the foundational understanding for a lot of Eastern cultures. If you go to Japan, Korea, places like that, honor and shame, massive. It's still in the Middle East. Are massive worldview shifts. We don't think of those that much. Watch what we have on television. Do we really think about shame that much? No. But it's a foundational understanding. So if you have honor, that means you are publicly affirmed as a person of value by your peers. And that value could be achieved by being born in the right family, having the right family connections, by your gender, by your social rank, by your public accomplishments. The Pharisees love to have the places of honor, and their flowing robes, and all those things. This is about being honored. Remember at the Last Supper, they argue about who's the greatest and who's going to sit next to Jesus, who's going to be at his right hand. And that they sit at a table called a triclinium, which is actually sort of like a U-shaped table, and the host would not sit in the middle. The Last Supper is actually not, the painting is not an accurate representation of the Last Supper. First of all, who goes to a meal and everybody sits on the same side of the table? Second, they're in chairs, which wouldn't be the case. A triclinium, three-sided, they recline at the table. The host sits at the very far, so if the thing goes like this, he's over here. There's only one person to his right. That's the place of honor. And it goes down from there. So Jesus teaches the parable, when you show up at a banquet, don't take the place of honor because somebody more honorable than you might come in and say, hey, this is my spot. So go down to the lowest place. Hey, who's going to be at your right and left in your kingdom, Jesus? It's not for me to grant, but you don't earn honor that way. How do you earn honor in the kingdom? The last will be first, the first will be last. The greatest among you, the most honorable one, is the one who serves. Upside down thinking. Not the one who's served, but the one who serves. Shame, of course, then, is lack of honor due to one's social position or due to losing face. You see shame as part of this whole, it's a thread that runs through. There's so many people dealing with shame because of their illness or because of their profession or because of their economic situation. And they're just non-people to everyone else, except to Jesus. And he blurs the lines between what's honorable and not. He's considered honorable by many of the elites. Look at how often he gets invited to dinner by virtue of his teaching, by his works, by his seeming authority. But then he goes to the meal and he challenges the upper classes, and when he does so, he increases his honor while shaming his opponents. I was reading this in my devotions just this morning. Jesus is invited by a Pharisee to a banquet, and he sits down at the banquet, and, people say, we're so glad you're here. And he says, oh, you Pharisees, you're like whitewashed tombs. And you're like, oh, Jesus, it's probably not the thing you want to say when you show up at dinner. But he's taking authority. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? That's not where you should be. You're dishonoring yourself. But what is Jesus doing when he does that? He's elevating everyone else around him. He's the host. Every meal that Jesus goes to, he's almost never the guest. He's almost always becomes the host. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus invite him in. Who breaks the bread? He does. So he's challenging this authority. And he spends time with people on the lower part of the social scale, which is seen as shameful by those on the upper scale. And this is one of the reasons why the elites eventually want to kill Jesus, because they have been shamed by a social inferior. Who does he think he is? Son of God, forgiving sins, blah, blah, blah. I mean, seriously? Who is this guy? He's a Galilean. Everything's getting turned upside down. Jesus is going to die on the cross. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. What the meaning of that is, why the mode of Jesus' death is as important as his death. Why? Someone asked me the question one time, well, couldn't Jesus have just died in his sleep for our sins? No, there's a reason. Because this is the most shameful death possible in the Roman world. And yet, now this is a symbol of honor. How does that work? Everything's getting turned upside down. Purity and pollution, clean and unclean. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday. The sacred versus the profane, the holy versus the common. Of course, you have the Old Testament purity codes in Leviticus, and those are really designed to define the boundaries for ancient Israel. I often look at it like God's making a covenant with Israel. He starts with Adam and Eve. The covenant's very simple. Don't touch that. Then it gets to Abraham. Just walk after me. Watch how I do it. And then we get to Moses, and the covenant is written on tablets of stone. And then we get to Jeremiah, and he says, no longer is it going to be written on tablets of stone. The covenant will be written on human hearts, and so forth. We're going down the line. It's almost like we're going from toddlerhood to adulthood. Because when you're a child, don't grab the stove. When you're in elementary school, where are the rules written on the wall? And then when you become an adult, you're supposed to know them. So these purity codes in Leviticus are kind of like writing it on the wall. Here are all the things that you need to know. This is going to define who we are. But impurity could result from all kinds of different things. Sexual intercourse, child rearing, or bearing, bodily discharge, touching a dead body, certain diseases, certain foods, liquids, animals. These are not the same as sins, by the way, but they still contaminate a person. So you might be outside the camp for a while, or you can't be around people for a while because you've defiled yourself in this way. So how do you deal with ritual impurity? You have to go through ritual cleansing. And so ritual washing is one of the ways you do that. Now, if you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem, outside the temple complex, you will see lots and lots of this kind of thing that's been excavated. It's a mikveh. Think of it like a large pool or a pool. You walk down into it and you ritually bathe. And then you come up out of that and you can be made pure. And then you can go offer sacrifices in the temple. But washing, ritual purity is very, very important. But of course, Jesus, here again, throws these laws, this assumption on its ear. He goes out and starts touching unclean people. It's supposed to make him unclean. But instead, what happens? They get clean. He doesn't get unclean. We talked about those two healings, and we talked about Mark's version this past Sunday. The healing of Jairus' daughter, and then in between you have the woman with the hemorrhage. Two different kinds of uncleanness, and yet in both cases, Jesus, his cleanness extends to them, reverses the flow. Jesus is going to emphasize the difference between ritual purity and moral purity. If you look at Mark chapter 7, the first 8 verses, listen to how he puts it. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. Parenthetically, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" Notice, tradition of the elders, not the Levitical code. This is the tradition that's laid on top of it. Jesus replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." You have to let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Jesus is saying, what really makes us pure or defiled? Not what goes into us, but what comes out of us. So he's blowing up honor and shame. He's blowing up ritual purity. Of course, then all of this is centered around the temple, which was the central Jewish symbol. Sacrifice and worship took there, the treasury. People paid a temple tax. If you lived out in the diaspora or you lived in Jerusalem, you paid a temple tax. You were supposed to make a pilgrimage twice a year. The priesthood managed the temple. It was kind of the symbol of religious life. The Jews called it the navel of the earth, where heaven and earth come together. But Jesus is going to go in and take this symbol, and he's going to turn it over. The religious life of the synagogue. The synagogue emerges after the destruction of the temple in the 6th century, where people in the diaspora, now scattered around, there's no temple, they begin studying the Torah as a substitute for sacrifice in the temple. So you study Torah, you study the scriptures, you read them in your town, you gather together for that. That's a temporary substitute until the temple is rebuilt and remade. It's the focal point of religious life for most Jews because most of them couldn't get to the temple. Now I'm running out of time here, so I want to go through these fairly quickly. I promise you on Sunday you're going to get more about the Pharisees. Okay, that's going to be a focus. So I'm going to hit this fairly quickly. But the question was, how would the kingdom of God come? Remember the messianic expectation. How is the kingdom of God going to arrive? Well, the Pharisees are an unofficial renewal movement. It's a lay movement. And they seek to draw Israel toward restoration and the kingdom of God through strict Torah observance. See, one of the reasons God hasn't returned to the temple, why things have not gotten better, why these Romans are still here, is because all of you Jews, my neighbors, are not following the law perfectly. If you would just get on board and follow the law, then God would come back and cleanse the temple and everything would be great. They probably numbered about several thousand, but again, they're not an official group. They're kind of the unofficial, self-appointed religious conscience. They saw themselves as people whom God would vindicate when he acted to rescue his people. So they're very concerned with purity. They're drilling down on the law because they believe that's going to solidify their identity as Jews in the face of this Roman pagan occupation. Now, my title for Sunday's sermon is Sympathy for the Pharisees. Catch a little Rolling Stones reference there. Because they're closer to Jesus than any of these other groups. Their agenda is driven by eschatological beliefs. They believe in resurrection. They believe in the consummation of all things in the end. But they believe that the kingdom would come through the reintroduction of tradition. Jesus, however, says the kingdom is going to come through a different sort of victory, and that's the victory of the cross. A new Israel embracing a vocation to be a light for the world, not building fences around themselves, but rather showing the way of God, the way of the cross. Come Sunday, you'll get more of that. The priests are temple authorities. They're permanent secretaries based in Jerusalem, small group of families, very wealthy families. Caiaphas, the high priest at the time Jesus is executed, but they're held responsible by the Romans for the conduct of the people. So if the Romans want to maintain control, they know that the best way for them to do that is to make sure that the religious people who control access to the temple and the religious life are the ones who are on board. So the chief priests and the Romans are always kind of making sure that everything is kosher together, pun intended. The priests depend upon the tithing of the populace. They usually live away from Jerusalem. Think about the story of Zechariah, John the Baptist's father. He and his wife Elizabeth live out in a little village. He comes in to do his service at the temple. And that's when he has this vision of the angel telling him he's going to be the father of John the Baptist. They're the main teachers of the law. They provide judgment in cases of dispute. They're the local representatives of mainline Judaism. So in a particular village, that particular priest would be the representative of mainline Judaism. You also have the Sadducees, who are the aristocracy. They're part of the priestly class. But they're in conflict with the Pharisees because they believe in free will, that God helps those who help themselves, And they don't believe in any other scriptures other than the Torah. So all the writings and the prophets and things like that, they don't deal with that. We're just dealing with the Torah. They denied the doctrine of the resurrection. Why? Because it doesn't appear in the Torah. They're not as successful in influencing the masses as the Pharisees are, and they do not survive the revolt against Rome that happens a few decades later, although the Pharisees will. And then you have the Essenes. We were talking about this earlier, about this community that kind of goes out into the desert and lives apart. They're not really mentioned in the New Testament, though some scholars have speculated that John the Baptist, because he was down by the Dead Sea, could have been one of these Essenes. Probably not, but he certainly would have known them, and they would have known about him. There's some evidence in their writings that may refer to John the Baptist. But their focus is on ritual purity and scripture study. The temple's corrupt. The whole Jerusalem establishment is corrupt. We're going to go out here into the desert, set up our own community. We're going to be the true sons of light. And that's where they spend their time, most of their time, writing scrolls and copying scriptures. Hence the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947. The Essenes kind of disappear from the scene when the Romans come on board, because the Romans, because of Masada down there in the Dead Sea, the Romans come down. The Essenes decide to vacate, so they take their scrolls, put them in clay pots, stick them in caves up in the hills until they're discovered by a Bedouin shepherd in 1947. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs of Jewish deliverance. And then you have the Zealots. Their whole idea about the kingdom is, well, we've got to fight these Romans. We've got to get them out of here. We remember Judah Maccabee back in the day, and now we need somebody like them to go out and kill these Romans, to start the insurgency. We did it once, we can do it again. Sicarii, they're known as daggermen. They're kind of the trained assassins. Now, some scholars speculate that Judas Iscariot may have been one of these Sicarii. And when Jesus doesn't start the violent revolution, Judas thinks, well, if I can get him arrested, that'll force his hand. He'll have to do something then. Interesting theory. They led the revolt of 66 to 70, but Jesus is going to warn about their agenda. So you have all these different groups, all with different expectations, and Jesus manages to tick all of them off because he doesn't fit their expectations. Of course, you have the Samaritans as well. They're in conflict with the Jews. The Assyrians invaded in 722 BC. They intermarried with the Samaritans, and so they're seen by Jews as kind of semi-pagans. They have a different temple that they worship at, Mount Gerizim, but they saw themselves as the true Israelites, standing in unbroken continuity with ancient Israel. So there's this massive conflict between Samaritans and Jews. Who does Jesus make the hero of many of his parables? Samaritans. Again, flipping over the convention. But the ordinary Jews are all caught in the middle. Not everyone identifies with the religious party. They pray, they fast, they go to Jerusalem for feasts. They kept the Sabbath. Pharisees might have been their unofficial teachers. The synagogue life was the center of community. It's just like our world. If you pay attention to the news, everybody's radical and out to kill each other. Most people, just trying to live their lives. We get along okay. Same thing is true in that society as well. Common themes that we're dealing with: monotheism, election, eschatology. We believe in one God. We believe that we're God's chosen people. But what is our role now in God's world? That's the key question that the Messiah is supposed to answer. One God had called Israel to be his people for the sake of the world. That God was expected to return to Zion, to the temple, to purify, to make things new, that would be mediated by the Messiah, who would gain victory over Israel's enemies. And once again, this would be the promised land. That's the expectation. And what does Jesus come in and do? He touches some of those bases, but not in the way that anybody thought, while at the same time turning so much of that societal understanding on its ear, but doing so in a way that's true to the intent of the Scriptures. Why don't people understand who Jesus is at the time? He doesn't follow the script. And yet, he's doing as God intended from the beginning. Our expectations often get in the way of what God wants us to do. That was the problem for the Pharisees. It's often the problem for us too. 7 o'clock, boom. Hit the post. I know some of you got to go to choir and things like that. We're recording this, so if you have questions and you're going off to choir, you can watch the end of this later and be able to hear the questions. But we have a couple microphones up here. I'm going to ask Jeff to be my mic runner here. So this is for this side of the room, and that one's for that side of the room, so Randy knows which one to turn on. Five and six. Any questions we have?
They're not on, are they? Check. All right, there we go. I'm in stereo. I see that hand.
A Baptist would, right, Jeff? Yeah.
So, getting back to the marriage.
Yes.
Do you concur, like in John 14, when Jesus says, "Behold," he's going to the Father, and behold, I am coming back to you in my Father's house are many dwelling places. People think a mansion is like I'm going to get a mansion, a Wyndham Hills home or something in heaven, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the fact that he's bridegroom coming back for his bride with many.
Yeah, he's talking about the Father's house, in my Father's house, the household. So you're now part of the family. We always think he's gone away, far away to prepare mansions of gold up in heaven somewhere along. That's Western thinking imposed on the scriptures. But what Jesus is talking about is a relational text, not a geographic text. In my Father's house, you're now part of the family. There are many rooms. There's a dwelling place for you. But where does Jesus intend to dwell? With us. We always forget when we read that text, the very first part of John's gospel, when it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. So yeah, you're exactly right. This is a different way of reading that text now that you know the background. Exactly. Yeah.
Can you elaborate if you know any more information? I've heard the theory before about John the Baptist being, at least spending time with the Essenes and learning from, the way in which they were studying scriptures and kind of, copying, scriptures. Is there any validity to him spending more time than just knowing about the Essenes?
We just don't know. I mean, there are certainly proximity can be an interesting connectivity. His lifestyle seems to indicate that, but the idea that he was trained by the Essenes and then left them, there's no real evidence for that. There's hints in his demeanor and how he does things, but you would think if he was part of that group that the gospel writers would have told us on some level, but it's hard to argue from absence. I would say he's Essene sympathetic or Essene adjacent, but not necessarily an Essene himself. He's kind of separates himself out there. Yeah. Other questions? I know we're going 100 miles an hour here, but it's a lot of stuff. Yeah. Go ahead and ask it, and I'll repeat it.
You talked about slaves in the early times and how it was different than we think of, that it wasn't race-based or something like that. But we have the time of the Israelites in Egypt, and they were, as far as I can tell, all slaves.
Yes.
And they were slaves because they were Jews. So does that fit in here somewhere?
Well, I would say they were slaves because they could be conquered. You know,
But they weren't conquered. They were there on their own volition. Well, we know that, you know, with Joseph, that's how the Jews ended up in Egypt.
right.
But over time, they became slaves because there were so many of them, and they were being...
Yeah, so the Romans, or the Egyptians took over. You know, they conquered them and made them into slaves. So, you know, again, it's a fine line. You know, like we've got people around us. We need labor. We're going to do this. We're going to conquer this people. The Romans are famous for this. You conquer a territory, you take over this territory, and you adopt those people into the Roman slavery system. So again, it's not like we're going to go target this particular group of people. In Egypt, it's not just the Jews who are slaves. You know, there are lots of other nationalities because they're expanding their empire too. So they're being absorbed, you know, all kinds of different people groups are being absorbed as these empires kind of suck up all the resources in a region. That includes the human resources in a particular region. So when the Israelites settle in Egypt, they're in the land of Goshen, which nobody wants to be part of because they're herdsmen. So they're seen as less than already, not really people, because they're herdsmen. So that's why they can't be in Egypt proper. They're in the land of Goshen. Well, okay, well, let's go take them over. Now, we don't get the story of how that happens. We get this sort of cryptic thing, you know, Pharaoh arose who forgot about Joseph. Yeah, but what did he remember? Oh, yeah, there's some people on my border that I need to get rid of because they're too numerous. They might rise up against me, so I need to conquer them in order to bring them back. You know, why does Pharaoh send an army out to bring them back? It's again, that idea that this is a threat, it's a nation, I would need to conquer them. There's a lot of different ways to read it, though. You know, the point being that we're not talking about the same kind of chattel slavery, you know, that were not in the same degree that we had here in the United States, where there was, you know, clarity around who was a slave and who wasn't based on race, based on the idea, again, that these are not human beings. You know, and, you know, you read the Dred Scott decision, you know, for example, 1857, you know, the Supreme Court says, yeah, these people don't have the same rights as everybody else because they're not really human beings. That's a different view in the ancient world. They say, yeah, you know, these people are, you know, we've got a whole bunch, but the point is we're now it's about power as much as it is about economy. It's more about power than it is about race, than it is about other things. Again, it's not a great picture. I mean, slavery is not a picnic. Because there are people who say, well, you know, slavery was much better back in the ancient world. No, it wasn't. You know, you had no rights as a slave. You had, you know, but anybody could be a slave. You know, if you got into heavy debt, boom, you're in slavery. That was true in this country in the 18th century. Indentured servitude, that wasn't based on race, but it was, you know, now you could work your way out of it, but, you know, you can be impressed on a ship. You know, you could be impressed on a ship, be taken off, and now you're going to serve this ship. Human cultures have done this forever. It's still happening. You know, but what's interesting about all this is what eventually kills slavery? The Christian idea of the equality of man. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, the person who wrote that was a slave owner. Don't miss that. But even Jefferson thought, you know, that the institution was on its way out. Because once you've entered that language into the conversation, now that stratification is gone. So this whole idea of equal rights of humanity is a Christian idea. I recommend a book to you by Tom Holland, who's a British historian. It's called Dominion. And he writes about, how so many people today are wrecking on Christianity, and because people are talking about equal rights, equal this, all that. Well, where did all that concept come from? Was equal rights a Roman idea? No. Was it an Assyrian idea, a Babylonian idea? No, it was a Christian idea, a Judeo-Christian idea. So there's slavery in the Bible, Hagar, all those kinds of things. It's an unfortunate part of the brokenness of human life. But what does Christianity do? Even by the time you get to the New Testament, it's laying a bomb at the base of the institution and about to blow it up. The British figured this out a long time before. Who drove the abolition of slavery in England? Wilberforce, who was influenced by one John Wesley. The last letter that John Wesley wrote in his life in 1791 was to William Wilberforce, urging him in his work to abolish the slave trade. And they abolished it decades before we did. One of the reasons why England doesn't enter the Civil War, it would look pretty hypocritical, to go on the Confederate side because we abolished slavery, and that's not a good look. We like the cotton and the tobacco, but that's not a good look. Anyway, that was a way longer answer to your question than you had asked. I got from Egypt to England. I don't know how that happens, but there it is. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I have a question about slavery.
Yeah.
Sorry. Not slavery, but taxes.
Taxes.
Yes. So you have different levels of society, and there were taxes to the Romans and to the temple, right? Were they all taxed equally?
I think it depended on where you were. There's not a lot of information about, they don't file returns or anything. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week when we talk about the concept of tax farming, which the Romans used. So Matthew's a tax collector. Notice how often tax collectors and sinners are grouped together, because their whole thing is, and we'll talk about this more next week, but just to give you a brief look at it, a tax farmer is an independent contractor. He pays a certain amount to the Roman Empire and says, hey, here's my quota, and then he goes out to collect taxes to backfill his investment. The Romans are also going to pay him interest on what he gives them, and then he goes out and he collects taxes from the people around him in a customs house or along a toll road or something along those lines. Most of the time it has to do with economics. The people who are destitute, poor, they're not generally paying taxes, but then you have people like Peter, James, and John who would pay taxes. They have to pay taxes to be able to go out in their boat and things like that. But the tax farmer could say, well, here's what you owe. So he's collecting a little bit over the top. He gets the skim off the top from that, plus he's getting interest from the Romans for what he invested. So it's a good deal because, we have this weird system where, the government knows how much taxes we were supposed to give, but they tell us every year, you go figure it out and we'll see if you're right. And if you're wrong, we'll put you in jail. How about that? We're going to test your math skills. Whereas, the U.S. government, is different than the Roman government, but taxation is I'll look some more of that up, Dave, because I think that's an interesting question. How are people taxed at that level? We just know how they were collected. I don't know so much about how they were distributed. That's an interesting question.
You at least partially answered my next question, and it sounds like if you failed to pay taxes or couldn't pay taxes, you could end up in slavery.
Yeah. There are a lot of ways to become a slave. Which makes it interesting when Paul calls himself a slave of Jesus Christ. He volunteers. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Interesting language. Anyone else? Well, I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. Next week, we're going to be looking at the Roman side of this, and we're going to be we'll talk a little bit more about Roman taxation. Now you give me a little bit more homework to do. And we're also going to talk about the Roman administration of this area. In particular, we're going to talk about Pontius Pilate, who is a historic figure. There's evidence for him and lots of evidence for Pontius Pilate and his relationship with the Jews and why Jesus' trial is what it is, and how the Roman Empire affected things not just in the time of Jesus, but afterward and on into future times out of that region. So God go with us tonight. May we have a great evening, and we'll see you back here next week. Thank you.